Alright, everybody, welcome to, I guess, our second taping or stream of Completion Critiques, which will be kind of like our new name from Achievement Analysis, where our goal is to examine the completion and achievement rates of games to see what we can learn about how well a game succeeded among its fan base. So after the last stream of this, we did some talking, and I think we've settled on a good groove for what we're going to be talking about and how each show is going to go. So for the streams, we're going to try and do 2 games a week, probably about 30 minutes apiece. For those of you watching this recorded, we'll post 1 recorded episode each week. So from what we talked about last time, we're not going to be giving games official grades. Instead, there are 3 things we are going to be examining for each title. Yes. We're going to examine what the churn rate of a game is. Specifically, how much of the people who bought the game completely quit the game before, it could even begin. And the reason why we're going to look at this is that the churn rate is the number of people who bought a game that most likely aren't going to be fans of this game or of the studio. They're the group that you are not going to be able to count on as a potential fan base going forward. From there, the next thing we're going to look at is the clear rate. How many people, or what's the percentage of people who actually finished the game? And of course, this is going to give us a good idea of those who are fans, those who you can expect that they are going to stick around and play your game. Yeah, and that is, of course, you can blame that one on YouTube for that delay. And then from there, we're going to take the 2 and figure out what exactly is the core base of this game, or the number of people who bought the game who you can reasonably rely on are going to be those who will be fans. And the reason why these are important is that this will allow us to kind of determine how much of a game actually succeed. So for this week, I'm going to try, although I'm not going to promise this for every show, is I'm going to try and have the 2 games be related in some way. Whether it's by genre, by complete opposites, sequels, whatever. And for this week, we're going to start with Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. This is a game that is very much story over gameplay, and then for part 2 this week, we're going to look at Grim Dawn, which is a game that is very much gameplay over story. And for this week, the reason why I chose these 2 games is we want to take a look at just how much having a good core gameplay loop really matters. Even if your game isn't focused on gameplay or interaction, if people don't like or they're not enjoying your game, all the story and prestige in the world is not going to matter. And Where the Water Tastes Like Wine certainly has it. As you've been seeing the trailer kind of like scroll by here, it had a lot of talent attached to it, from those who wrote the game to those who did a voice acting for it. It has a unique style to it. But as you look at these screenshots, you're probably noticing something. The art and just overall appearance of these kind of story vignettes is a far cry from when we actually get to the gameplay. And you see a scene like this. And you're going to see over the next few minutes just how much of that created churn for Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. And I hate to keep bringing this game up, but it's still a game that I feel a lot of people argue that it did better than it did. That, surely it was the audience that didn't like the game, or, people are just being critical of it. And we have seen games that are critical successes and commercial failures. And again, I don't know if this game is a commercial failure or not. Only the developer will be able to answer that. But it is a game with a very low review score after being out for at least 3 years. And for this game, or for the show, we want to try and keep it to reviewing games that are no less than 2 years old. I think that is the bare minimum. We want, I think, ideally 3 years or more out. Because at that point, we can assume that the majority of the fan base and the majority of the consumer base has bought the game. Yep, to the 800, less than 800 reviews. Metacritic of 74, but we really don't care about that here. And what we're probably going to see if we scroll down and look at all these reviews is that people are going to talk about the story a lot. Now, whether they talk about the gameplay is another story entirely there. And it was priced at 20. I think it was priced higher than that at launch, but I don't remember. But let's get to the nitty-gritty here, and let's look at these achievements. So for those of you who are new watching, we're looking at the Steam Global Achievements for these games. Because this will tell us, at least with some measure of accuracy, maybe, the number of people who bought the game and their relation to completion. So, in a game like this, even though this is story-driven, there is still progress to be had in terms of moving around the map, finding these various people, but the big issue I'm sure you've all caught by now is that almost within 20 minutes of playing this game, 40% of the fan base, or 40% of the player base, stopped. And I'm going to pull up, I just want to see where I actually got in this game. Because I don't think I got much further in terms of my achievements. Let's see. Yep, I made it to the Hobo Kid part. Let me see. Yes, it tastes just like wine. So, the Hobo Kid, that is about 15 to 20 minutes of play. And Where the Water Tastes Like Wine completely lost 40% of its player base before we even got 30 minutes in. That is horrible. While we're not going to be issuing grades on the show, we're still going to talk about whether or not this game did good or bad. And losing 40% of the people who bought your game within 30 minutes, that'll have to be a Patreon incentive. But losing 40% is not good. And even that is not the official end of the churn rate. Because if you look right here, we go from 60 to 39 to 26. So, to be reasonably kind to some extent, we're going to say that the churn rate is going to be, let's see, we lost, what would you say, 80, no, I'm sorry, about 73.1% of that rate. So, churn is 73.1. And the churn rate, you want that to be as low as you can. You want a high stabilization rate. Because people, once you get past the churn and you're at where your game stabilizes, these are the people who at least enjoy your game to get past the early pain points or anything that kind of stop them. So, with a churn rate of 73.1%, that means that, again, only about 26.9% of the people who bought Where the Water Tastes Like Wine played it enough to say, I want to keep playing this game. And that is a terrible thing. I may put up there the stabilization rate as well, just to have 4 things. Yeah, maybe I'll do that just to make it a little bit easier for everyone to keep track of. So it's stabilized at 26.9. Also, I think I'm going to run out of room, so I may have to shrink this down just a little bit, but I'll have to adjust that as need be. So it's stabilized at 26.9. If we keep going down from here, you can see that the churn rate has decreased dramatically. 26.9 to 25 to 23, 23. And this is what you want to see. You want to see very low numbers from progression achievement to progression achievement. No, it's stabilized at 26.9. But it keeps going down and down. There we go. And we keep looking. It's still going down. It's still very much going down. And if we count the ending as storyteller, that is at a clear rate of 5.1. So, all the 26.9% of people who stuck with Where the Water Tastes Like Wine enough to play it, only 5.1% of that group actually saw the game through to the end. And yes, that is not a good sign. Now, to kind of extrapolate what the core base of people who play this game was, we're going to divide 5.1, or we're going to divide, 5.1 by 26.9. Because again, we cannot count the 73.1% of the player base who were churned out as anywhere near potential fans or consumers of this game. So if we do that, and I have my lovely calculator right here, 26.9 times it by 100. So that means that 18, we'll round it up let's round it up. We'll round it up to 19% of the people who stayed with the game kind of would be considered the core base. And I think this is a case of the game just did not resonate with people. I actually started playing A Night in the Woods on my own because that's another game that I want to take a look at in a later show and see how well that game did in terms of retaining its audience. But from what I personally played of Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, and again, for me, I fell into churning right here. That I just found the gameplay just not at all interesting or something that I wanted to play in order to get to these stories. We should at some point, as another example, look at one of Failbetter Games' titles, because their games are very much story driven with gameplay second, and I'm curious to see if their churn rates are any better. Yeah, that was another game that kind of blew up among indie circles. So what we can see here is that the gameplay, from what I played of Where the Water, like there were cases where you had like limited resources, like it just felt very ponderous to play. And for a game that's all, or the focus is going to be on the stories and all the unique people and voices that you hear, a lot of people did not want to put up with that. And again, going from 60 to 39 to 26, all within probably the span of, I don't know, 40 to 50 minutes. That is not at anywhere considered good. You want your stabilization rate, you want low churn and high stabilization just to begin with. Because if you can only churn, let's say, 10% of your fan base or 10% of the consumer base, that means that you are starting at 90% of the people who bought your game at least played enough to learn the core gameplay and say to themselves, okay, I want to play this game more. And this is why, when we look at this is not, unfortunately, a success of a game design. Even if this game did pull in a lot of people who bought it, a lot of critics who loved it, losing 73.1% is bad. Well, that we can actually tell to some extent, Pony. If the clear rate, if you have let's say you have a stabilization rate of 26, and the clear rate is 25 or 26, that means of the people who at least stood or at least stuck with it, did clear the game. So that would mean that we had a core base of 100% at that point, or 95%. And that would indicate that this would be more of it's a niche success. It still would be considered a success at that level. It could do better to be more welcoming and inviting to other people. But at least the people who said, I understood this game, they still beat it. And if we do get to something like La Mulana or Spelunky, we'll be able to see whether or not that holds true or not. No wine here. But again, you can even see that the completion achievements, the ones that are about seeing these stories all the way through to their very end, it starts at 8.6%. So even if, these stories are so emotionally resonating and amazing, not even 10% of the people who bought this game or even played this game actually saw them to the end. And that, unfortunately, and here's the other thing, I don't know if these achievements, I'm assuming they count press keys and review keys as well. So a lot of this could even be just the critics who kept throwing praises at Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. And we may not know exactly how much of the consumers play this game all the way through. Because again, at a clear rate of 5.1%, that is not good. I would say if your clear rate is at least 30% or higher, I would say that is acceptable. If it's, less than 20%, something broke down somewhere. And again, if your churn rate is, more than half your player base, yeah, there's a big problem here. Water tastes like churn. What does that taste like? But there really isn't a lot here that we can more or less talk about. So we let some of this footage go. We don't want any music. I love it when Steam just automatically plays the music for you. But as we go through this, you can see how some of this gameplay interaction was going to work. And I remember it had something to do with matching these various cards or playing them. And it's very much trying to kind of gamify or abstract how these stories work. But again, you can see such a sharp contrast from the gameplay related screens to the story or narrative driven scenes. Churn tastes like churn, yes. And unfortunately for this game, and what I think developers have to learn the hard way, story doesn't really mean much to the consumer base if they can't enjoy the gameplay. And as we look at other games that are also story-driven or franchise-driven, I'm sure we're going to see lower churn and higher stabilizations. Which part? Churn and chum. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at my chat is a little stretched out because of how my UI is. Turns out the yog. Anyone want some chum? But with that, the lessons again are that story-driven games are a harder sale, I think, for consumers these days. Especially when they come at kind of a higher price for that level of gameplay. Now again, I'm sure a lot went into the productions and the aesthetics, especially getting the writing and voice acting talent. But when you're trying to sell somebody on a game, they expect, again, some enjoyable level of gameplay. I mean, even though something like Gone Home didn't exactly have high-stakes gameplay and moment-to-moment design to it, it wasn't, horrible to move around and explore. And that is something you have to understand, that the first, middle, and end of your experience, you have to look at the core gameplay loop and the moment-to-moment gameplay. If you can't get that working, or if it's bad, most people aren't going to stick around. You're going to have people who will. Again, we have of the 100%, or I'm sorry, of the 26.9% of people who stuck around to kind of figure out where the water tastes like wine, 19% of that group we could assume are fans and will probably buy the next game almost sight unseen. But you want those numbers higher. Even though there's a wolf gambling right now, you want to, hedge your bets and mitigate the risk as much as possible. Because if you can't do that, you're going to have less or fewer and fewer, people try your next game and your next game. And this is where we often see any developer struggle, that let's say their first game sold 50,000 copies, and then the second game sells 35,000, and then the next game sells 20,000, and they're just making the same thing. And the problem is that the consumers don't want to play your same problems. Maybe. Well, he's voiced by Sting. I'm sure Sting costs a lot to do the voice acting. But you want to see these numbers grow. And one of the things that when we do take a look at kind of the first game into the second game, these rates should improve. Because you have more people who have already been established playing your game. You don't want them to go down. And as a company, you don't want to see that as well. Because this is where we often see critical successes and commercially ending disasters happen. That everyone who stuck with the game enjoyed it, but that may only be like 15% of everyone who bought your first game. and then you try to make another game and hope to get 100%, and maybe only 8% of those people show up. And you just spent 3 to 5 years and who knows how much money, and you're not getting that back. And again, this is where UI, UX, and playtesting come in.